I'm welcoming everybody, and I'd like to acknowledge that for all of us here in Australia, we are on Indigenous country, and I acknowledge our elders, one of whom may be able to join us today on the road. She's on the road from a remote Indigenous community to Fremantle, but she's going to try and log in today during the webinar if she can. So I acknowledge that any Aboriginal elders and people who are present, this is their land, we are here, has been their land, always will be. I'd like to talk about our theme very briefly, and then I'm going to move into introducing our 4 speakers. So our theme is activist research and reflections during the 2020 pandemic. You'll notice that's an active word. It's during the pandemic, it's still going on. Around Australia, we've had very different experiences of the pandemic, but we've all experienced something of it. And so today we have 4 speakers who will be speaking to us about that. They're in a rapid presentation mode. They've been asked to get onto a soapbox for 5 minutes, discuss it with us for 5 minutes, move straight to the next speaker, and then at the end we hope to have some time for a plenary discussion about where do we go next? What have we learnt today? What do we need to do to move forward? So I'm now going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is James. She needs to find her cheat sheet. So they're not going to introduce themselves because once they get on that soapbox, they've got a masterful command of time, and they were doing it in 5 minutes. So I'm going to read their bios. So first of all, I'm introducing James Arvanitakis. He's the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Engagement at Western Sydney University. He entered academia after having worked as a human rights activist across Asia, Europe, and Australia. Now he's just returned from 12 months at the University of Wyoming as part of a Fulbright fellowship where he researched political partisanship.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for this. And I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional lands in which we all scattered across this beautiful and amazing continent of ours. I suppose I want to begin by talking a little bit about COVID as a political actor, and having spent the last 12 months in the US. I returned in April, so right when all the major shutdowns are happening. I came into Australia and did the quarantine. But as part of that, I saw, I suppose, my research is in political partisanship, and I watched a shift happen in the way that the pandemic influenced, I suppose, a US perspective. I will say that just before I left, I was consistently asked who I thought was going to win the election in November, and I had no doubt that Donald Trump was heading towards a comfortable victory. But the pandemic has changed that, and I think it's really highlighted, I suppose, the many other issues in the US, and I think that's why it's such a an important political actor. And there's 2 or 3 I want to talk about. The first is that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted vulnerable communities and communities of colour. So specifically, I don't know how much if you know about the US, but the average household, the average Black American household, has 1/10 of the wealth of the average white American or Caucasian household. 1/10. So we're talking the difference between $17,000 from $7,000 to $70,000. That's net wealth. So you can see the difference, and this has just really highlighted those vulnerabilities. And if you see that a lot of what really, while the death of George Floyd sparked the Black Lives Matter protests, it was actually an accumulation, a build-up of the fact that a lot of Black Americans are on the front line, and a lot of vulnerable communities on the front line of both the sort of the level of poverty, but also on the kind of work that they do. And I think up to 5 or 6 times more likely to be infected and die from the virus. That's one thing that it's really had a major impact on. The second thing is the way that the virus is actually given rise to a lot of conspiracy theories, and most of these are right-wing conspiracy theories. And we've heard about QAnon, but there's many others. Now, research, which I can go into if I had time, but highlights that actually conspiracy theorists tend to vote more, right? And so, in an interesting contradiction of Trump being seen as sort of not being very good at dealing with the virus, an interesting contradiction of that has very much been the fact that conspiracy theorists are getting behind Donald Trump on a lot of the work that he's doing. And so, so these are becoming interesting political actors. And for those of you who have been following, there's now been the election, or there will be most certainly an elected official who is backed by QAnon and other conspiracy theorists. The third thing that I think is really important is the way that surveillance techniques are impacting or beginning to impact our everyday lives. And I suppose this is where I really contacted Ann, what really drive me to sort of raise this issue. And if we compare this moment to the sort of the last big global crisis, and if that was, say, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, we can look at that time in Australia alone. There's been 82 different pieces of legislation that have passed directly influencing that have been driven by this kind of need to make Australia safer through surveillance and other types of measures. The rise of Daesh or Islamic State added to that process. Now, if you look at this process, none of those 82 pieces of legislation have been, or 76 have passed. I think 6 are still to be passed. But in that time, none of these legislations have actually withdrawn, and where there's been sunset clauses, those sunset clauses have been extended. So just to finish off, it's interesting to see how surveillance now, and a kind of a biometric surveillance technology, is increasingly being implemented to keep us healthy and safe from the virus. And the question is, what will this mean the longer term for our democracy? Will these surveillance techniques be withdrawn, or will the threat of the next virus, the next sort of global pandemic, used to keep that at bay? So that's, I think, right on my 5 minutes.
We're going to do the questions with James straight away. We've found in the past, if you don't do that, one of the speakers gets left out. So let's have some questions or comments to James about the issues that he's raised. Okay, I've got a query, James. So one of the things I have found quite challenging as an Australian citizen is tracking the emergence of new legislations. During this period, Australia suspended sessions of Parliament. Where's that checking process happening during this period for that surveillance legislation that you've mentioned?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think, there's a number of organisations, mostly the sort of the more traditional kind of spaces of human rights, like the Human Rights Commission. The Australian Human Rights Commission is one of them. There's some really amazing Australian Human Rights Lawyers Network doing some very good work, and some of those numbers that I quoted come from them. And it is hard to keep up. It's like an avalanche, and if again we're still seeing the makeup of what's happening. But there was a recent article in The Conversation, which I'll share on the chat section, that the chat section, which said that a new piece of security legislation since 2001 has been issued every 6.7 weeks. So a new security legislation in every 6.7 weeks, and you think about the impacts of that on our democracy, it's scary. So it's when we begin to break it down that we begin to see how threatening this really is. Now, again, we've been caught in this phase, as you said in the introduction. So we're in the middle of this whole thing, right? So we're still seeing how this will play out. But it'll be interesting to see how the virus becomes, or the future threats of pandemics become, I suppose, securitized, become an issue of security rather than one of cooperation and public health, and what type of impact that'll have. And we're already seeing that on the impacts of refugees being seen as being, framed as a potential threat, framed as potentially bringing the virus with them, and used an additional way to actually keep people away from reaching the Australian mainland. So I think it's a very much watch this space.
Thank you very much. I was just going to add something to James's comments. I think the rise, we're seeing a whole plethora of new social norms being established now that are really, that term unprecedented, One of them is this rise of the othering and the rhetoric around China and other nations and nationality. So these are really extremely disturbing broad trends in terms of, you know, polarising views. Do you agree, James?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that norm making is so powerful now, right? And again, you know, when you ask people, you know, most of us, you know, will say, "Oh, yeah, of course we can understand some more sort of, you know, some more processes being implemented to keep us safe." But I remember at the time when I was talking about the source of the virus, I kept on using this term "wet market," and I didn't even know what that meant, right? But it just sounded so scary. And so I was like, oh my God, yeah, it must be a wet market. You know, like everybody else, I was just freaking out. You know, I haven't got any special superpowers. So I was just like totally freaking out. So I went and checked what wet market was, and essentially a flea market. And it was not like, it's nothing. It's like we have wet markets, you know, and usually as tourists, we go to these places or as local folk and get food and stuff like that. So we always get this stuff. So it's interesting how that process, Bill, that you just highlighted there, not only creates a sort of a new sort of norm setting, but actually creates a massive fear, a massive othering. And I think that's something that's really, really hard to deal with. And as you know, we all, you know, I mean, for me, in many ways, Donald Trump is just a megahorn for something that's happening. But, you know, his description of it now is the China plague, and how that has just become this really powerful, you know, this relation to China. And I think it does create, you know, if you go back to the historical perspective, especially the anthropological analysis of the way that you know, Western cultures have often framed non-Western cultures as being dirty and filthy, and you know, that kind of that gap is, I think this is happening all over again, but in a different way, because it is seen as being these bad habits, you know, the way that people, you know, bad hygiene habit that's given rise to this. And I think that becomes a real threat as well. So that's a really good point.
No, that is a good point. I'm going to move us along, but perhaps we can keep in our minds, those of us who can think of many things at the same time, as some of us can, is when we move into the plenary, let's discuss with James what actions can we take as citizens in Australia, what's available to us, how do we move on this issue. So thank you, everyone. We're on time and our soapbox process is working well. Our next soapbox is going to be stepped up onto by Bill. Bill Calcutt has undertaken complex social research for over 3 decades in sensitive policy and advisory roles in Australia. His areas of interest include governance, accountability, ethics, risk management and counter-terrorism. In 2019, he completed a major thesis on the primary motives for volunteering in Australian emergency services. Bill, your soapbox.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate, and I commend you for organising this. I'd like to start by posing a rhetorical question, and that is, why are so many of Australia's vital social and welfare support systems not fit for purpose? And the sort of areas that I'm talking about here, well, obviously aged care in the news today, but public housing, disability support, Indigenous welfare, child protection, family violence, mental health, suicide, homelessness, poverty. I ask the question, are the causes of systemic deficiencies in our system historically adequate funding, multiple levels and layers of government and bureaucracy, a lack of explicit national standards, excessive secrecy, or even the inability of the private sector to provide social services in a compassionate and effective way? Well, I pose that question because my thesis is these limitations tell only part of the story, and that something deeper and attitudinal is at work here. And that key factor is the influence of powerful cultural forces comprised of implicit negative values and the absence of explicit positive values. And the sort of implicit negative values are things like, you know, the complacency, she'll be right, pervasive opportunism in Australia, an abiding suspicion of authorities, cold poppies, and a sentiment that you don't rock the boat or drop in a mate. More importantly, perhaps, is the missing explicit positive values and principles in a formal national values framework, such as a charter or a constitutional Bill of Rights, that codify and really institutionalise things like respect for the founding principles of dignity and equality, that reward honesty, integrity, and also recognise the importance of transparency and accountability as the foundation for representative democracy. So these core values can provide a powerful foundation for an inclusive, respectful, compassionate and just society, because they need to be championed and modelled by national leaders. So what we have now, and I mentioned in the context of the pandemic, which I haven't referred to yet, is that these deficiencies have been really revealed and exacerbated by the pandemic. And a current crisis in integrity and trust in public office means that in the absence of systemic support for the highest ethical standard and a national code of conduct, people who have the courage to speak publicly about systemic failures are often characterised as whistleblowers. So I'm really raising a broader issue there. Briefly, as a case study, I could allude to that, and it's really a microcosm of the broader sense, and that relates to my thesis that looked at emergency service volunteering. The thesis concluded that a decline in altruistic values matched by a rise in egoistic values is making the recruitment and retention of emergency service volunteers more difficult. And also within the organisations themselves, the absence of clearly defined core values, as is in Australia, in a way they're a microcosm of Australia, impacting on volunteer commitment and retention, while the presence of conflicting values is contributing to volunteer turnover. So my research has demonstrated that in the context of a decline in formal volunteering and an increase in the frequency and severity of catastrophic and natural events, the whole system of leaving the protection of communities, thousands of local volunteer-based brigades, is simply a model from the past, that it's a failed model. And now it's going to be the subject of some inquiries that are underway into the devastating bushfires over Christmas. It'll be very interesting to see what comes of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Questions or comments to Bill?
Yeah, I've got one after James.
So, James, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
So I was clapping. I had a question. Allegra, if you want to go, I got one, but I can ask him later.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bill, and thanks, James, as well. I really enjoyed both of what you've had to say so far. Bill, really interesting. I'd absolutely love to read your thesis. It sounds fascinating. And this is a slightly unfair question, but I have to ask it, and maybe you have some thoughts that you could share. I was just wondering if you make any comments about where you think this started, if that's even possible. Do you think it's related to maybe neoliberal values in society, individualism? I was just wondering it's a massive question, and obviously couldn't expect you to answer it, but I was just wondering if you'd be able to give a few thoughts about whether or not you know, kind of, how did we get on this track?
Well, interestingly, it's a unique phenomenon for Australia. I could discuss about some of the Western dimensions, but this country has had an unusual history in terms of involvement, for example, in human rights. It's been very, very active. It was active in the formation of the United Nations, and it was particularly active in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's been assiduous in its avoidance of institutionalising those values in legislation. So we just don't have. Constitution is a worthless document other than as an administrative arrangement of states, federal-state relations. It says nothing about us as a nation. It might be a blessing in terms of its neglect of our recognition of our Indigenous heritage. But we don't have the institution that really codified or codify these values. And I really think we're talking about systemic issues here across all of the sectors. We have inquiry after inquiry after inquiry. You only have to go back to the Black Deaths in Custody inquiry in 1991 and see how these inquiries have been ignored. Our capacity for complacency as a national trait seems to have no limits.
Kind of moving it, yeah, I see what you mean, moving it on by way of an inquiry to somebody, I guess, kicking the can down the road rather than solving. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, Bill. Really enjoyed listening to what you had to say.
Any other questions or comments, reflections to Bill?
I had a quick one, Bill. I really feel what you're talking about in regards to the change of values and that individualism. I'm wondering, and maybe this is something to talk about in broader, whether we can see any potential for change there. Like the crisis we're going through, is there the potential for the change into the idea of community more, or is that a little bit naive on my part?
All of the facilitation of these changes have been by technology. The elephant in the room for society is technology. Technology enables us to shrink our worlds and become reflexive. It's the ultimate of enlightenment, really. It's the individual as a world and unto themselves. So what's reflected in volunteering, for example, is that people no longer want to commit long-term to traditional roles. They're still getting involved in some ways, but that lack of interest in a broader social being has declined dramatically in the last 20 years. And technology is accelerating that process, which is such an irony because technology is a facilitator of connections. It's a facilitator of an enormous range of connections, not connections of morality or emotion.
And Alistair, you're muted. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick one in terms of that. I mean, about 3 decades ago or so, the public administration, public policy debates were being couched in terms of hollowing out of the state, in terms of the administrative element of the state, and a large cause of this was the privatisation and the subcontracting outside the public sector. To what extent do you think there's a sort of follow-up, which is almost a hollowing out of society in terms of the volunteering and the decline and the changes that you're observing going on, possibly as, in part at least, a consequence of the same sorts of trends, which I for one abhor, and I'm sure one or two other folk do. So, yeah.
I completely agree. I think your characterisation is completely accurate. There is a problem, though, without some national principles and a set of core values. You don't know where the bottom of the barrel is. You can go to, regarding the Universal Declaration about arbitrary detention, you can create gulags overseas, you can put people in them indefinitely when they're confirmed refugees, you can do all sorts of things. Now we're going to reveal the way we treat elderly people in society is about to be a shocking thing. We've already revealed the parlous state for disabled people. You know, I mean, everywhere you look underneath the surface, there isn't moral foundation. I don't want to use the term moral, actually, ethical is probably more appropriate. There aren't ethical principles there. You leave all of this discourse to politicians to mediate and to negotiate and to compromise over what are really sometimes quite fundamental issues.
But I think part of it as well, isn't it, is that the, if you like, the bonds which have held everything together, or which, whether or not they did actually, thinking about it, maybe there's a golden age argument here, but commoditized, everything's been commoditized, consumerized and monetized, and that's replacing, if you like, what I suppose the sociologists would tend to term the value proposition, to use a horrible phrase, that guides society. Anyway, I'll come off.
Can I just add?
We can come back to that. So let's hold on to the thought and stay in a really creative space. We need to come back to Bill in the plenary, and I think there's many activist moments for sociologists with a and people with a sociological imagination in Bill's work, but we'll come back to it. I'd now like to introduce Christian. Since completing his PhD thesis on academic precarity in 2019, Christian has turned his efforts towards volunteering and hosting a range of local and online community events. His goal is to cultivate more familiar and affectionate relations between otherwise disparate individuals and communities in an increasingly online, asynchronous world. Christian, here's your soapbox.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thanks for organising this. Thanks also to Sally, as always, to our speakers, to our audience, and happy birthday to Dan for the other week. Okay, so I've got a tantalizingly short amount of time. If anybody would like references on my writing, I've put my email address at the top of the chat box so you can contact me afterwards. Okay, so the social activism group bills itself as having two focuses. One is sociology about activism, which uses theory and research and vitally draws on related fields to create knowledge and improve understanding. The second is sociology for activism, i.e., how can we be better activists? How can we improve our chances of achieving the change that we want? So in this talk, I'm bringing these two together in order to just give a few recommendations. It's informed by three main areas. The first is my observations as an organizer. The second is my sociological work on precarity and the pandemic. And the third is a human factors concept called mental workload, which informed my more recent work as a research assistant for a UWA report commissioned by the Australian Navy. So as Anne pointed out, I have my fingers in lots of pies for organizing events and coordinating communities. When COVID hit, of course, that had to go online, and I started getting more and more people contacting me saying that they are zoomed out, which you're familiar with, and saying that they just don't have the energy to engage in this kind of stuff, to talk with people or have anything to do with an event with the word politics in it, for instance. Now, these are clever, conscientious, and respectable people who are saying this, okay? So for many of you, this will sound familiar. We've all heard about pandemic fatigue, right? I would say that this is part of a broader sociological context. So what do I mean by this? Last week, The Conversation publicized a meta-analytic study by the American Psychological Association, which linked insecurity and unemployment to the tendency for people to develop negative personality traits, so they become less conscientious and more neurotic the more insecure they are. People familiar with my work and the work of Guy Standing would be familiar with how precarity leads to the 4 A's of anomie, anxiety, anger, and alienation. The less secure you are, the more uncertain you are, the more jaded and pessimistic and less engaged you become. So while the social activism literature focuses on strong social ties and a sense of duty and identity as positive forces for people engaging in activism, I see these dimensions which I've listed as negative forces, as problems to be addressed and overcome. And I think that human factors can help us to understand this. So I want to draw on the idea of human factors and mental workload to frame this issue and give some tips to address it. So human factors represents the attempt to account for the human in the analysis of complex systems. It's become increasingly popular in the wealthier and more dangerous domains. So industry, railroads, airlines, military, navy, places where they stand to maim people if they get things wrong. Okay. The idea is that you can't treat people like mechanistic parts of a system. Okay. While you can put a command into a computer and it will execute it, you don't need to worry about whether or not the computer is more concerned with its own time or its own career mobility, or if it's tired because it's been out all night drinking or trying to get its little computer babies just to go to sleep. Now, these are human dimensions, human factors. It's humans that have to deal with pandemic fatigue and anxiety. So the concept of mental workload comes from human factors. I'll simply call it load. It's been formulated and measured in a lot of different ways. It doesn't mean the amount of work that you have to do, okay? Rather, it refers to the conditions in which work are imposed, the context, and how people experience and respond to that. It's the mental checklist. It's what you have on your plate, what you have on your shoulders, what you have on your mind. This can include anything from workspace design and equipment. Human factors is also known as ergonomics, which you would have heard of in the workplace, to an intimidatingly cluttered inbox. Who here has gone into their email and you see how many emails you have, and all of a sudden you're like, oh God, I've aged 50 years and I just want to roll over and go to sleep. So these all desert demands on your mental load. The more load one has to contend with influences the perceived effort of the task. In this way, load impacts your motivation, your confidence, your attentiveness, your mood, your fatigue, your ability to communicate effectively and considerately with other people. So here we arrive at the theoretical point, right? The sociology about activism. With enough perceived load, even seemingly minor tasks, responding to emails, making a bed, doing the dishes, getting in touch with friends, or committing to social events can become exhausting. You kick the can down the road and things fall off your plate and you don't do it. This in turn can be viewed in our context of our historical moment and the disruptive material conditions we're going through, not just with the pandemic, but with our 21st century noisiness. We've seen spreading precarity, increased pressure to stay informed with the news and the proper norms and expectations of our culture, increasing demands placed on people wanting to keep or at least find jobs and hopefully establish a stable living. And as critics of our neoliberalized society observe, people are experiencing a narrowing of horizons down to the present. You can't plan ahead. You think a few weeks at a time, okay? An increased embeddedness in the tertiary 24/7 information-soaked society, okay? So here we begin to see the broader picture, the sociological picture, in which the aforementioned psychological study linking insecurity to negative personality traits intersects with Standing's work on the precarity and the 4 A's. We begin to see how feeling zoomed out is not just about Zoom, and how pandemic fatigue is not just about concerns to do with the virus. Okay, so that's a theoretical point. Now we have the sociology for activism, the recommendations. So if you accept that feeling overloaded impacts motivation and engagement, we can thus say that load and contributing to load poses a problem for anybody wanting to organize events and engage people in activism. Moreover, it is not enough to simply tell people to take on less, to say no to more, or to organize their calendars better, because this places the onus on the individual and ironically, viciously creates more load. No. We can do things as sociologists, as coordinators, as organizers to help people out here. So I'm going to give you just 5 quick dot point strategies to help people out. This is just a beginning place. So number 1, set regular times and places for your events so people don't need to follow up on where they are and when they are every time they happen. Okay, if you have important news to give it to them, give it to them at the event. Okay, this will give them some sense of stability and constancy. Number 2, of course, avoid unnecessary emails and clearly mark keywords in your email so that when people search for them to find that important information a week or a month later, they can do so easily without trawling through the inbox. As academics, we do this with keywords when we write journal articles. Why not when we write emails? Number 3, when inviting people to an event, let them know that their presence is enough. Okay, the obsession with potlucks for activist organization events deters people, I promise you. A law of a meal is not as strong as the bummer of having to think about what to cook, find the time to cook it, and so on. Number 4, give people a chance to develop their civic skills and their networks before you try to recruit them. If they know what they're being signed up for and they feel like they've signed up themselves, they will engage more than if you just track them down after meeting them and try to get their email address. And number 5, remember that a no leadership, democratized, horizontal approach to organizing can result in vacillation in a 3-hour meeting, just going with people being heard rather than decisions being made. And that can undermine momentum. Do not presume that it's the best approach for moral reasons. Okay, you need to think, how are you contributing to load as well, I would contend. So I'm going to conclude by saying these are simple ideas. I hope you can all see how they're aimed at the goal of reducing load. I also hope you can see how it's just something that you can keep in mind. You can come up with other tips for yourself, not only to improve the likelihood of people engaging in activism and engaging in civil society, but also to help reduce the load that is being alive in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Comments and questions to Christian?
I'll just make a comment, and thanks, Christian. I love the way that you had some practical tips. I'm definitely going to do the email, or not do the email thing, and do the highlighting keyword thing. I think that's a great idea. Yeah. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
No, I'm thinking, Christian, but when we get into the plenary, you've given us some very practical stuff, and I'm really glad Ramon is here, because I can foresee a conversation between a number of us about how do we mobilise the wisdom that you've presented with us today to be a more effective association, because we are having our virtual event later this year. Any other questions or comments to Christian? Alistair?
Perhaps just one. How do you see the balance between, if you like, systemic responses to this? In the sense, I'm thinking here about the increasing concern about, say, mental health in higher education, which has taken off as an industry over the last couple of years. Systemic responses to it, because it seems to me in part it is systemic problem, and what I've sometimes termed sticking plaster responses, which institutions are really good at, such as putting on little bits of workshops here or there, or giving you a link to a website or whatever. How do you think that plays out, that sort of interaction?
That's a great question, Alistair. It comes down to what I said before about positive strategies and negative strategies. So the positive ones often put the onus on the individual. Have you checked in on your well-being? Have you done yoga? You know, how is your breathing? Are you breathing deeply enough? Right? Do you say no to enough? Are you good mates with your calendar? All of these are individualized, positive approaches. They're band-aids on top of a rash, okay? Which is funny when I think about it, because that's not a good way to treat a rash anyway. Okay. What I'm proposing is a negative approach. Rather than giving more, take some away. So do what you can to decrease the noise, decrease the load. In the Navy, in airlines and industry, they know that if you give people 10 tasks, even if they're really easy, if you give them 5, they'll do those ones better, even if they're simple. So as a systemic approach, I'm saying, rather than the neoliberalized discipline of the self, which we see, you know, take care of yourself as life gets harder. What I'm proposing is that we as public sociologists and as organizers do what we can to decrease load. Does that help answer your question? It
does. So you're a supporter of the slow work, slow life approach?
Most definitely. There were lots of buzzwords in my talk, like 24/7. So that would have brought things to mind, I'm sure.
Excellent.
Thank you, Christian. I'm going to be the time bully and move us along. We can still accommodate part of this in the plenary. So let's keep moving. I'd like to introduce my co-convener for the thematic group, Sociology and Activism, and that's John McGuire. John spent his undergraduate years at university fighting for and defending higher education in Western Sydney. Since then, he's completed a PhD in sociology and politics. His research interests include education, popular culture, and social change. He's currently the academic director of the Sydney City campus of Western Sydney Universities, and he tells us he misses his undergraduate days. Here's your soapbox, John.
Thank you, thank you. I just want to acknowledge I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation today, and I'm just going to, hopefully people don't mind, share my screen and just give a few quick slides to help me along and also help me to keep on track so I don't fall too far behind. So look, what I wanted to talk about today was just something that I've sort of been playing with at the moment, which is looking at protests during the pandemic, because I think one of the things that I found very interesting is we're hearing all this talk about we're living in a new world, there's going to be new ways of doing things. And to a certain extent, when I'm looking at the sort of actions that we're seeing happening in the community, and I'm going to talk a lot about the United States, I'm seeing the same sort of protest approaches in the past. But I guess what I'd find really interesting is, protest by its nature, public protest, part of its strength is it breaks social norms and creates attention. And in some ways, these protests during the pandemic are even stronger in that regard because they're breaking the social norms, obviously, of staying at home and not going out. So I found that sort of really interesting. So what I was doing is just thinking, all right, well, we hear a lot about the Spanish flu pandemic. I wanted to look a little bit about how protests happened during the Spanish flu pandemic, just to sort of look at if there was anything we could compare, and then also sort of look and see if there's anything that might sort of give us some idea of what's going to happen with some of the protest movements that we're seeing at the moment. So the first one I started off with is looking at, and I looked at two divisions, I should say. I looked at protests that were really about the pandemic and about the restrictions the governments would place on people. And then I looked at issues which were powerful in the society at the time, issues of repression that predated the pandemic and had a sort of narrative before that and how it happened. So just looking at the Spanish flu, the protests, I guess, October 1918 is where we start to see in the US governments introducing voluntary social distancing measures, closing, the sort of entertainment areas. They choose many of the different city governments chose not to close churches and things like that. There was a reduction in business, but a lot of that had to do not so much with businesses being shut down by governments, but just the fact the nature of the Spanish flu, the sicknesses the illness would hit younger people, which meant that there was a high amount of absenteeism from work, which really did slow down that sector. Specifically, I was looking at in the early days, there was a lot of voluntary action. So there was a call for people to wear masks in many cities. And a lot of the reports were like 80% of people would voluntarily do that. In fact, there's a lot of arguments that says there's a certain point where you can get the population to follow sort of unwritten rules by, asking them to do it. And then there's a point that you need to bring it in. So I was really interested in looking at San Francisco because there was the anti-mask brigade that happened there for a very short period of time. San Francisco went through sort of two mandatory mask decrees where the mayor basically said everyone had to wear a mask in public. The first one was from 25th of October to the 21st of November of 1918. And there was penalties if you were caught without a mask. You faced the possibility of a $5 fine and a charge of disturbing the police. And there were lots of cases of people getting arrested and jails getting overthrown. Jails getting filled up with people who had refused to wear masks. Although a lot of the reports are, it wasn't so much people having an issue with wearing the mask, like a political issue or a health issue. It was more people just trying to get away with not having to deal with it, not wanting to deal with it. There wasn't too many collective protests. There was some individualized protests of people complaining about it. There was a situation where a bomb was left on the steps of the mayor's office, which he blamed on his mask mandate, but there was no evidence that actually that's what it was. After the infections went down, they rescinded the mask mandate. They brought it again in January, 17th of January, and this is where there was some mass opposition to it. So this is where the anti-mask brigade, anti-mask league. So they were a group of people who were included physicians, included professionals, included elected officials as well. And they had a meeting on the 25th of January. And the issues that they were talking about was they were questioning the science of masks. So they basically said the masks weren't any good. And they definitely were looking at things there in regards to the science of it as well. The other thing that I guess I wanted to, and I really should go through quick because I've realised I'm almost up by 5 minutes. The suffragette movement in the US happened during the Spanish flu as well. And it was interesting to see that what happened in regards to that protest there is that the movement changed. And so we're unable to do mass meetings. They ended up doing a lot more relying on their grassroots activism. And so a lot of different ways, relying on newspaper bulletins, also relying on communication, a lot of phone calls and so forth. So that was really interesting to see. What was interesting is as a movement, they were Spanish flu conscious, like they were really conscious about social distancing and stuff like that as well. When I look at what we're looking at now, I guess the two sort of protests I looked at very quickly, protests about health restrictions. So we've seen the protests in the US, which are a lot of times framed around freedom and are framed and have there's a political aspect to them. They're really obviously targeting Democratic state governors very much in regards to health restrictions there. They certainly, there's lots of evidence that they're being supported by far-right groups and funded and organised by many far-right groups. And definitely we're seeing that far-right element of them as well. We've also seen, and it can't be understated, that white supremacist nature of these protests about health restrictions and their clear politicization in regards to the American election. It's interesting because the Spanish flu, the anti-mask league, actually a lot of the people who were at the head of that were political opponents of the mayor of San Francisco, which is often not talked about. Very quickly again, the one I was looking at, the issue that predates the pandemic at the moment with COVID, just looking at Black Lives Matter. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I know I'm already over time, but again, this is a movement that you can see is COVID conscious in that social distancing has certainly been part of the protest that we've seen. I mean, I've used the photo there of the activists wearing masks, which we've seen. And so there's a lot of sort of definitely evidence that it hasn't contributed to COVID infections in the US, but just the sort of interesting thing there. So yeah, just very quickly, looking at them, both the so-called health restriction protests in the Spanish flu and COVID, we're seeing there is a political element there. The anti-mask league, it did stop existing once the issue was resolved. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the right-wing sort of freedom protests we're seeing in the US. And also, yeah, that point about suffragette and Black Lives Matter movements and the fact that in their activism, obviously, when you protest, like you're breaching now an additional norm, but also we can see the measures that have been taken to make sure that they don't, increase the damage of the pandemic. So I'll stop sharing there and thank you.
Thank you, John. We've got a few minutes with John. Some questions or comments to John?
I'll ask a question if no one else is.
Thanks, Ashley.
When you said just before about it, it wasn't like for political reasons, people just weren't wanting to deal with it as far as not wearing a mask goes. So I guess that's denial. Is that what you're talking about?
So it wasn't so much, it's interesting, it wasn't so much people denying that the flu existed. Like, that was really interesting to see. There wasn't too much that. It was more people, certainly in the case of San Francisco, they were traveling through San Francisco to get somewhere else, and they just didn't want to bother with the process of buying a mask and having to wear it. Is about the hope of getting away with it. When they were asked why you didn't wear a mask, they just sort of said, oh, look, I really couldn't be bothered. I thought I'd get away. I thought no one would notice. So that was the first stage with that first mandatory mask. With the second one, which came in sort of in that second wave in January, that there was much more political opposition. It did become about, you know, people saying that this isn't effective, and people saying, you know, that that's where it did become a more politicized. It was about, you know, the mayor overstepping his bounds and, you know, restricting individual liberty.
Interesting. So I think we see that a lot now. This denial element is like a huge driving force in people's decisions. I guess, what do you think of, like, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think is and this goes back to something James was talking about a bit earlier on. I think when there's fear out there and people are afraid, like, you know, safety is a big concern. When people start to think, oh, actually there isn't an issue, or I'm really not in a risk group, then that lengthens, reduces the strengths of that argument. I certainly think it is it's quite an amazing thing, because when I looked at sort of evidence for that same sort of thing in the Spanish flu, people saying, oh, it doesn't exist. There just wasn't there. People accepted, you know, that when doctors said that this is a real reason, people accepted it. There seems to be a lot more opposition to that now.
James?
Yeah, thanks, John. That was great, and some really nice observations. But just a couple of things to add to that. One is, yeah, I think the other thing that I think is really interesting at the moment is that we are living in a bit of an anti-intellectual or counter-intellectual moment. So I think that, you know, and this goes back to some of the things that Bill said about trust. You know, you mentioned trust a few times, and we are living at a moment where we've got a big gap in trust between. And I think that's a really powerful observation to make. I think the other thing that's really interesting, and you know, after having spent 12 months in the US, and people that know the culture also will know that, you know, one of the things that constantly surprised me was, you know, in Australia, when we have something like a challenge, like a global pandemic or a bushfire or whatever it is, we expect our governments to lead, where a lot of the times in the US, the response was, the government just has to get out of the way, right? So the cultural position of the government in that dealing with crises is seen as being it's so radically different, right? And it really threw me. And you know, and I was constantly asked, like, is it true you have a government health provider, like this thing called like Medicaid? And I say, yeah, it's Medicare. And they're like, how could you let government near your healthcare? And it was like, it's a mind-blowing thing, because we always think for us, it's the opposite. It's like, the further you can get private companies away from our healthcare, the better off we'll be. So it's a really fascinating, contradictory, like clash of perspectives. And I think you've captured it really well. So thanks for that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, like, America is such a contradiction in so many ways when you research and look at it. Like, one of the things that I did early in my research is looked at 9/11 and looked at the fact that, you know, when America had that choice between trading liberties for security, and in fact how popular that trade-off was, and how popular Bush was in regards to that idea of safety. And I've always had a theory that one of the things that certainly brought him undone and certainly contributed to Obama's election is, you know, Bush got up and said, this is the American dream of safety, security, I'll keep you safe. And then Hurricane Katrina proved in such a clear way that it wasn't safe, and he wasn't keeping Americans safe in that way. But yeah, it is a very, as you say, very interesting, very, you know, going back to what Bill was talking about, that individualized aspect of American culture, that, you know, lone cowboy, you know, on the frontier is just such an important part of their ideology.
So in the 5 minutes, I suggest let's have an open forum, and we've got people here from all around Australia, as I've spotted various people I've known from the many past lives ago, which is why I was greeting Alistair and the mosquitoes in Adelaide. Alistair was in a senior position at the university where I did my PhD, and it's now 7 years since I graduated LSS, so I made it. So let's think about our plenary. Our plenary idea is, where do we go now and what's next? We've got a really interesting intersection of issues happening across our 4 speakers. So one of the things that James and Bill have addressed is that very big picture stuff about both cultural, that I think they're leading us towards, and I'll check in with them, a shift towards cultural change, and how do we do it as a community of sociologists and concerned activists. I hear Christian giving us very practical stuff about how to work well together as we work together towards change. And in John, I hear a historical reflection that helps us make better meaning of what we're going through at the moment. Meaning making is very important to me. John, and I'll have a chat with you about that on another day, because I think out of meaning making, we develop a sociology of hope, which is a research trajectory I've been following for the past couple of years. So, thoughts or comments? Where do we want to go from here?
If I add just to say, like, I realized I actually haven't presented any research or done very much research at all this year, and so I love that opportunity to like, you know, have a goal to put something together. And it was great to actually catch up and present that and talk to it. I'm wondering if this might be something we could do even a little bit more regularly, just to make sure during this time that we get the chance to share this sort of stuff.
Yeah. So keep the processes going is something you're putting forward, John? Christian, do you think that that's possible and achievable?
People like you, I've got no doubt whatsoever.
Okay, so the first activist moment is we have found a process. I have pushed you hard with the 5-minute soapbox, but we found a process, and let's keep our eyes on the process. The other thing I've heard people talk about, especially I think with James and Bill's presentation, is an activist agenda. And that is the need both for a cultural shift, but also something else. I think I'm hearing, and I need to check in with you if that's what I've heard, but also the need to attend to some human rights issues, and in particular, the absence of a Bill of Rights and the absence of a code that we have helped shape, which then helps us, I'll use my words, develop activist and lobbying points, that there is something we can turn to and use as an instrument or process for essential conversation in our communities about human rights. So I'm going to toss that idea back at James and Bill. Are you setting the agenda for us?
I'll answer first if that's okay. I think sociology, the focus of sociology ultimately is about systems, about social systems, and in a way we're marginalised and neutered by being forced off to one side without making a contribution. And even, to be honest, I've worked in academia too, living in a little pond which doesn't really feed into broader social discourse. I would see activism as actively engaging with the community, not just ourselves, but trying through publications, through the conversation, through bridges that go from across this forum with really valid research and good arguments and reason, science. Try and engage in the broader sense, because if we don't do that, we're really stuck with, you know, we could have run a whole thing about writing a thesis when 6 people have read the thesis. You know, I mean, what the fuck is that? Sorry, didn't mean that, but really, you know, that's really just such a shocking thing to say. And our own industry, academia, is in crisis now. You know,
in crisis.
Funding, didn't even get funding support. So I think, you know, if your activism is about seeing sociology in the broader context, in my view.
Yeah. James?
Yeah, thanks, Anne, and thanks, Bill. Look, there's a few things come to mind. One of the one thing is, I think we should remember that the Bill of Rights, when they had when they did that inquiry into the Bill of Rights, they got a record number of responses, higher than any other, and the vast majority of them were all for a Bill of Rights. And I think this is something that remains a really, really powerful idea, that this democracy of ours is vulnerable. It's not the be all end all, but we do need a counterbalance to some of the legislative changes that we've seen. I also think that there's a couple of areas here that we, and you know, this is a bit of a thought bubble, and I wish I could do a little thought bubble thing here, but you know, when I put up a link to the Brookings Institute a report onto social capital, you know, and one of the things that they talked about in that discussion about social capital was how it's one of the issues that crosses the left-right divide. That's actually one of the issues that can bring people together if framed correctly, if framed in a way that that is about, you know, grassroots up. It's about wanting better communities, about wanting communities that are more inclusive. And I think that there is a space here to sort of extend, in a way, Bill's point about sort of saying, well, how do we frame this into more of a public engagement? You know, and you know, and this is really, I think, where in a way it does really take, you know, lead in from Christian's perspective, that it's not always in these grand gestures that we can find change, but in the everyday practices and the respectful way that we treat each other. You know, we often talk about sustainability, for example, but we rarely practice it or demand it from those around us. You know, like we'll tell our co-writers, come on, dude, this is due at midnight. You know, leave your family behind and come and finish this article with me. You know, like as if the world will end. And we do that all the time. So I think within Christian perspective, you know, there's a real powerful moment for us to always reflect on practicing. You know, going back to the old cliche of the personal is political. You know, in the way that we treat each other, not just in our you know, the things that we say, but really the respectful way we treat each other. So I do commend everyone to have a look at that Brookings paper. It was really powerful. It was sent to me from a friend of mine who's actually a right winger. Right, and he sent it to me, and he said to me, "Read this, man. This is something you and I can work on together." And it was a guy that I got to know in the US quite well, and it is fascinating for that reason. So yeah, I mean, just a couple of, I suppose, macro and micro places where we can try and meet.
Great, thank you for that. I'm sorry to put you on the spot unannounced, Annabelle, but Annabelle, you've done a comment there for Christian. I'm wondering, are there any thoughts you'd like to share with us during the plenary?
Thanks, Anne. I can't participate in the next session, but Christian invited me. Thank you, Christian. And I certainly want to use the opportunity to talk one-to-one. I mean, it would be great to do it with everybody, because it's really good to have different input. But everything Christian said resonates with me, especially because I've just come out of a class, first year university class, talking about activism and critical pedagogy, and you know, a group of young people first year out of school talking about, you know, what was happening last year, and wondering how that's changed or shifted now, for all different reasons. The difference between if that's, I mean, all of the local students were sitting there saying, yes, this is part of our education, this is part of what we were involved with in school. We were, you know, and it did depend on the teacher, not so much on the curriculum, but the way the teacher was wanting to bring in this activist perspective. And then the number of people who were silent, who I'm assuming are people that would remain silent, whatever their personal perspective might be. And it's probably, in a way, it's reflective of any larger group of people that, yeah, anyway, lots of connected thoughts. So I'll get back to you on that, Christian. Thank you, Anne. And thanks for letting me participate today.
I'll just quickly say, Annabelle and I met at Taza in Cairns way back when, staying at the same backpackers, and we've been friends since. So thank you, Taza, for our friendship.
Thanks.
We're 10 minutes over, but I think most of us are pretty relaxed about that. but I think I should be the one who moves us towards closing the webinar, unless someone wants to shout out that we need another 5 minutes. Then I'll start moving towards closing our webinar. I think I have heard two things that come out of today. One is a comment that this has been a useful process, and that we're going to consider how we might be able to continue to do the process focus. And secondly, that some of us think we've seen both an agenda and a way of being that we want to pursue, and that agenda does seem to centre around having a Bill of Rights. There are possibilities for us to continue to work together, and for that to be supported and encouraged with the sociological imagination that TASA encourages us to take up. So I'm really glad Ramon's here today. We've had Allegra here, and we've had other very powerful and senior people within TASA here today, because we'll be talking with TASA about how do we continue. We found something powerful, and we want to keep working in this space. So I'm going to move towards closing us within, unless you stop me, within 2 minutes. I'd like to thank a number of people, but I told Sally yesterday I absolutely adore her, and Sally makes so much possible for so many of us to be engaged with and work with TASA. TASA is now my preferred arena of activism, and I'm aiming now most of my activist energy into my professional association. So I'm looking forward to that being a space where I can work, but Sally has empowered us to have this. We have used TASA resources to do this, and we have, I'm very grateful to her for her patience and gentleness, and her incredible capacity to build relationships and networks. And if you've ever...
You're going to make me cry, Anne. You best stop there.
Thank you to Sally, and thank you to Sally for being Sally, because we could not have done this without her support.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank each of our 4 speakers, and I'd like to thank everyone who's come along today. Kayleen, it's great to see you here, mate. And I wonder then if we could wrap it up, and I can see some of you are using the usual way, but shall we wave?
Thanks, Anne, for organising this, and thanks to all the speakers.
Okay. Anyone who wants to stay is welcome to, but I'm now officially closing the webinar.